My husband abandoned me and left with his mistress, leaving me with debts and a mortgage. One day, my 11-year-old son told me, "Mom, I'm going to get revenge on my dad," and days later, the boy committed the worst crime of his life. When Laura heard the sound of the suitcase zipper sliding slowly, she felt like her heart had just been disconnected from the real world. The rain was pounding furiously against the window panes, as if trying to warn that nothing would ever be the same inside that house. The kitchen was nearly dark, lit only by the flashing light of the microwave clock. The smell of hot soup lingered in the air, but neither the aroma, nor the warmth, nor the familiarity of home could mask the sharp sensation that dominated the atmosphere. At the entrance, Marco stood still, holding a black suitcase in his hands. His face showed neither anger nor guilt. It was an empty mask. He wore the same leather jacket Laura had given him 3 Christmases ago. The zipper was pulled up to the neck as if he wanted to protect himself from a storm he had created himself. Laura watched him from the kitchen door, still with the apron tied around her waist and her fingers wet from the tears she didn't know when had started to fall. There was something brutal about this scene. It wasn't just the confession to come, but the certainty that he was already gone. He had ceased to be there long before he said it. "Are you going to say something, or just stand there like a stranger?" she asked, her voice low, cracked. Marcos looked down. He avoided her gaze. He always did that when he was about to do something cruel. "I'm leaving, Laura." The phrase didn't need any embellishment. It was a sentence. A slow, but inevitable execution. "What do you mean you're leaving?" she asked, taking a step forward, though she knew exactly what it meant. "With Carolina." The name dropped like a knife into the silence. Carolina. 20 years younger. One of the girls from the marketing department. A woman with teeth too white, laughter too loud, and skirts that ended too soon. Laura had noticed. Of course, she had noticed. But she had lied to herself day after day, as if the lie were an ointment for forgetting. "You have a son," Laura said, her body stiff, barely holding back. "And a mortgage. And a wife. We haven't worked for years. You know that. And that's why you're choosing to leave like a coward? Just like that, with a suitcase and no looking back?" Marco sighed. He didn't even dare to raise his voice. He knew that what he was doing was indefensible. "I tried to be honest with you. I don't want to live a lie anymore. And why weren't you honest before you got into bed with a girl who could be your daughter?" Marcos pressed his lips together. For a second, something broke in his expression. Maybe shame. Maybe just annoyance. "I'm in love with her." Laura laughed. A broken, dry laugh. "Is that what you tell yourself at night so you don't feel like a miserable person?" Behind the half-open door in the hallway, 2 dark, round eyes were watching. Daniel, with his newly turned 11, heard everything. The words floated toward him like darts, leaving, lie, in love with another. He didn't fully understand, but something inside him, something deep, broke silently. Laura felt it. She felt her son close, felt his vulnerable presence on the edge of the abyss. "And Daniel?" she asked now weakly. "What are you going to tell him? That dad got tired and preferred another family? I'm going to keep sending money. I won't leave them completely alone." "You think this has to do with money?" she snapped, furious. "You're leaving and the only thing you can think of is, 'I'll send money.' What kind of man does that?" Marcos, without answering, bent down to pick up the suitcase. His goodbye had no tears, no remorse. He was in a hurry. The door opened. The cold of the night rushed in like a slap. "Tell him I love him," he murmured before disappearing into the rain. Laura slammed the door shut. She leaned her forehead against the wood and felt the weight of her body stop obeying her. She fell to her knees, without dignity, without restraint. Tears streamed down like daggers. "Mom?" Daniel was behind her. He had stopped hiding. His voice trembled. She looked at him. She wanted to smile at him. She couldn't. "Dad, he's not going to live with us anymore?" "No, son." "Why?" Laura swallowed hard. She wanted to say so many things. That life is unfair. That people break. That love doesn't always last. That his father was a coward. That she had failed too. But she didn't say any of that. because he didn't know how to appreciate what he had. Daniel nodded with a maturity that didn't match his age. And that was what hurt the most. That night, Laura didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, the TV on with no sound, staring at nothing. The lightning cast shadows on the wall. The future was a thick fog that wouldn't let her breathe. In the morning, the bills were still there, stacked on the table. The mortgage, the car loan, the credit card. Marcos had taken his clothes, but not the responsibility. Laura went to the bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror, and didn't recognize herself. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks pale, her soul shattered. But still, she washed her face, made breakfast, and woke up Daniel as if it were just any other day. By mid-morning, when the routine was starting to turn into a survival ritual, someone knocked on the door. It was Carmen. She was almost 70, her gray hair tied in a low bun, and her eyes the wisest Laura had ever seen in her life. "I saw you last night through the window. I could tell something was happening," she said, walking in without waiting for an invitation. "I brought some homemade bread and valerian tea." Laura couldn't help it. She broke down in tears in the hallway. Carmen held her in her arms like she was her own daughter. "Cry, honey. Cry as much as you need. But don't break. Not you." They sat together in the kitchen. Carmen poured the tea. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer empty solutions. She was just there, with her warm presence and respectful silence. "He left," Laura finally whispered. "With someone else. He left me alone with all of this." Carmen nodded without surprise. Cowardly men always leave at night, like thieves. Because deep down, they know they're stealing a life that doesn't belong to them. Laura looked at her with wet eyes. "I'm scared. Not just for me. For Daniel. He doesn't say it, but he's changing. He's quiet, distant. What hurts a mother burns the son. And what isn't said goes in deeper. I don't want him to hate him. But I don't want him to admire him either. I don't want him to see him as a role model." Carmen took her hand. "Let him see the truth. And let him see that his mother doesn't give up. That will mark him more than any betrayal." The phone rang. Laura didn't answer. She knew who it was. Marcos always called afterward to see how everything was going. She didn't want to hear his voice anymore. That night, Daniel came into the kitchen while she was washing the dishes. "Can I sleep with you tonight?" Laura looked at him. She nodded. "Of course, my love." In bed, he hugged her by the waist. "Mom, I don't want you to cry anymore." "I try, darling. But sometimes I can't help it." Daniel remained silent for a few seconds. "What if I could do something to make him regret it? To make him come back?" "It's not your responsibility, son. You can't fix what you didn't break. But I want to help you. I hate seeing you sad." Laura kissed him on the forehead. "Just by being here, you're already helping." What Laura didn't know is that the seed, this need to fix everything, had already started to grow in Daniel. What broke inside a child's soul wasn't always heard, but its consequences could be as loud as an explosion. That night, while she finally slept, Daniel quietly turned on the computer. Shadows danced on the walls. His face, lit by the screen, was that of a child, and at the same time, it was the face of someone about to cross an invisible line. And the suitcase, still at the entrance, continued to leave a smell of farewell hanging in the air, as if the echo of abandonment hadn't completely gone away. But Laura didn't know that the worst was yet to come. The cursor blinked like an anxious glance on the screen, waiting. Daniel didn't exactly know what he was searching for, but he knew he had to do it. That night, while Laura slept deeply after days of emotional collapse, he dove into the laptop his father had accidentally left in the guest room. It had no password. An absurd mistake for an adult who had decided to betray his family and disappear in the rain, taking everything except his conscience. Daniel wasn't typing with anger. He was typing with something darker, need. There was something burning in his chest since the night he heard his mother fall to her knees behind the door. It wasn't the tears that hurt, it was the dry sound of her body hitting the floor. His mother had broken. And he, though only 11, understood perfectly that adults didn't always know how to put themselves back together. In the days following Marcos's abandonment, Laura had become an elegant shadow. She walked as if she had stones in her shoes. She spoke smiling, but her eyes were as empty as those of an old doll. She played at normality, like someone playing at not drowning in a room full of water. She got up early, made breakfast, did the laundry, prepared food, and went to the hospital. Always with that ridiculous phrase that Daniel now silently hated, "Everything will be okay, son." He no longer swallowed those words. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew they weren't real. He had noticed how his mom sat in the kitchen in front of an empty cup for long minutes. He had heard Marcos's calls, which she ignored. He had seen the mailbox fill up with white envelopes with red logos. And he had started to feel that anger had a form. It was hot, sharp, and lodged just below his stomach like a stone he couldn't expel. The cruelest part was that Laura kept trying to protect him. She lied to him. Every day. She told him that his father loved them, that he needed time to understand things. That life was complicated. That adults sometimes made mistakes. That it wasn't anyone's fault. But Daniel knew there was blame. Someone had done harm. And that someone had a name. And that person, now, was laughing somewhere, between the legs of a woman with shiny lips and empty eyes. Laura came back from the hospital after 7 in the morning. She was exhausted, with sunken cheeks and sore feet from long hours in the emergency shift. The first thing she did was look for Daniel. He was already dressed, with his backpack on his shoulder, sitting at the table without breakfast. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, as if the daily greeting could hide the disaster underneath. Daniel nodded. "And you?" he said, without looking at her. Laura hesitated. "Not really, but it's normal after a long shift." Daniel stared at the tablecloth. "Did Dad call?" She swallowed. Yes, he had called. Twice. Voicemail messages, WhatsApps, one of them with an absurd photo of a coffee and the phrase, "thinking of you." Ridiculous. No, nothing. A lie. He knew right away. But he didn't say anything. He just stood up, grabbed his backpack, and headed for the door. Laura wanted to stop him. She wanted to hug him, or at least say something. But something inside her broke every time she saw that indifference. That deafening silence. Daniel had stopped speaking to her with his heart. And that hurt more than Marcos's abandonment. After closing the door, Laura sat in the kitchen with the cold tea. She didn't know whether to cry or just faint. Deep down, she was starting to feel afraid. A real, visceral fear. Not just because of money or debts. She was starting to fear her own son. What was growing inside him? That darkness that was growing in his eyes. That afternoon, after sleeping a few hours, she went to visit Carmen. She brought a bag of apples and bread as an excuse. But in reality, she needed her voice. Carmen was the last thread that connected her to reality. To something resembling calm. "I don't know if I'm doing things right anymore," said Laura while pouring herself some coffee. Carmen looked at her, slowly resting her elbows on the table. "No one knows if they're doing things right. The only thing you can do is not give up. And not lie to your son. That's something you can't allow yourself. And if the truth destroys him? What if knowing that his father chose someone else turns him into a cold person, someone who hates? And if not knowing it turns him into someone who pretends to love, just to avoid looking weak?" replied Carmen without raising her voice. "The harm is the same. But when it's done from the truth, at least it leaves a clean wound." Laura didn't answer. Instead, her eyes filled with memories. Blurry images, some happy, others tense. She remembered the times when Marcos would disappear for business trips. The arguments about money. The long silences at the table. The forced, mechanical sex. The excuses. The cheap perfume on his shirt. She remembered the time she found a message on his phone, and he, without even blushing, said, "She's just a friend who is being playful." She remembered all that and understood, with painful clarity, that love had left long before Marcos closed the door. She had just clung to the ruins with bleeding hands because she didn't want to accept the demolition. Meanwhile, Daniel was browsing the computer in his room. He found folders with names like Budgets 2022, Commission Seat Julian R. Nothing interesting. But something caught his attention, a hidden folder named Dossier MM. When he clicked on it, he saw PDF documents, graphs, names of companies he had never heard of. There were words like misappropriation, offshore, discrete payment, indirect beneficiary. He didn't understand anything, but he sensed that it was something his father didn't want anyone else to see. And if it was a secret, then it was something he could use. Every night after Laura fell asleep, Daniel would go back to the computer. His face showed a concentration that wasn't typical of a child. He copied files to a flash drive, took down emails, looked up meanings for words that even adults didn't fully understand. Daniel's silence grew heavier. He no longer argued. He no longer asked questions. He no longer requested bedtime stories. He no longer smiled when Laura made his favorite meal. One night, Laura tried to hug him on the couch while they were watching a movie. He quickly got up as if physical contact burned him. "I'm tired. I'm going to bed," he said. "You won't even let me hug you?" she whispered. Daniel shrugged and walked away without responding. Laura sat there alone, listening to the final credits of a movie she couldn't remember. She felt an emptiness so vast that, for a moment, she imagined screaming until she lost her voice. But she didn't. She just took a deep breath, as if trying to survive underwater. That night, she dreamed of Marcos. She saw him sitting in front of her in the kitchen, drinking coffee. He apologized. He said he had made a mistake, that he wanted to come back, that he loved her. In the dream, Laura forgave him. They hugged. They cried together. But when she woke up, the only sound she heard was the clock marking 4:03 and the light in Daniel's room still on. She got up barefoot, walked in silence, and opened the door just a few inches. She saw him in front of the computer, writing something. She watched him for a long time. She didn't want to interrupt him. She went back to her room and closed the door. Something wasn't right, and that feeling would grow like a crack. Carmen, days later, said it plainly. "That boy is up to something." "Why do you say that?" "Because kids don't talk like that when everything's fine. Because they don't look like him unless they have a plan in their head. And because you and I know he carries the same fire you had when your dad left with that secretary and your mom defended him just like you defend Marcos now." Laura froze. She hadn't spoken about this in years, not even with her therapist. But Carmen knew. She'd always known. "I also thought I could save my family," Laura confessed. "I ended up carrying the guilt of everyone. And now I don't want my son to inherit that weight." Carmen took her face in her hands. "Then stop pretending everything is fine. Because he already knows. And he's acting on his own." At that moment, Laura felt something. A shiver. Like she had just reached the top of a mountain where everything looked clearer and more dangerous. Because Daniel wasn't just keeping quiet. He was building something. And it wasn't a childish tantrum. It was something else. It was revenge. Patient. Silent. Smart. And when it exploded, nothing would be the same again. Not for Laura. Not for Marcos. Not for Daniel. Not for anyone. The attached file finished uploading at 3:14 a.m. The screen showed, "Sent successfully," and Daniel remained still in front of the computer, his hands sweaty, his heartbeat pounding his neck like a war drum. There was no evil laugh, no heroic gesture, no sense of relief. Just that sharp silence, that vast emptiness that opens when you cross an invisible line and there's no turning back. He had forwarded the documents to 3 email addresses. One belonged to Julian Malverde, Marcos's direct boss and owner of a business record cleaner than a silver platter. Another was sent to someone listed as majority partner, a faceless name that appeared in several of the financial folders Daniel had opened and copied onto his USB drive. The third, more by intuition than logic, was sent to the address for the Ministry of Finance he found on the anonymous tip-off page. He didn't fully understand what he had done, but something inside him vibrated with a cruel certainty. He had hurt someone. He gently closed the laptop. He stood up slowly, walked to the window of his room, and stood there, watching the night continue its course, unaware that an 11-year-old boy had just seeded a storm. The next morning, Laura woke up with a pang of anxiety she couldn't explain. She prepared breakfast mechanically, as though each movement were part of a choreography imposed by habit. Daniel came into the kitchen in silence, sat down, and ate without a word. "Are you okay?" she asked without looking at him. "Yes, just tired." "Are you sure?" Daniel looked up for a second. His gaze wasn't the same. He didn't seem like a child anymore. He seemed like someone who had buried something and was carrying it inside him like a ticking time bomb. "I'm fine, Mom." Really? After school, Laura returned early from the hospital. She took the day off. Carmen had insisted she needed to rest, though Laura knew it wasn't rest her body was asking for. It was clarity. Time to face what was happening in her home. The computer was in the guest room. Still warm. Still with the remnants of a night where someone had crossed the line. Laura turned it on, not knowing what she was looking for. She had no reason to suspect, but she had intuitions. She started going through the folders. She quickly noticed the history of open files. The email. The PDF documents with graphs of money moved to tax havens. The lists of names. The transfers. Her heart raced. She clenched her fists. No, it can't be. She searched and sent. There they were. 3 emails. 3 sent items. Attachments. Everything Marcos had carefully saved. Her body went numb. She climbed the stairs with calculated slowness. Each step weighed like lead. When she reached Daniel's room, she pushed the door open without warning. He was lying down with headphones on, but when he saw her enter, he quickly took one off. "Is everything okay, Mom?" She didn't answer. She sat in front of him, resting her hands on her knees. "I need you to tell me the truth. And I need you not to lie to me." Daniel lowered his gaze. "Did you go on Dad's computer?" The silence lasted too long. "Yes." "Did you send those files?" "Yes." Laura felt dizzy. She closed her eyes, opened them again. "Who did you send them to, Daniel?" "To his boss. To another contact I don't know. And to a government whistleblower site." "Why did you do that?" Her voice cracked. "Because I had to do something. You cry every night. You don't eat. You don't sleep. He left and left us with nothing. He laughs. Lives with another woman. And you just pretend everything is fine." "Daniel, listen to me. This is not your responsibility. You're a kid." "I don't feel like a kid," he shot back, now with a firm, trembling voice. "I feel like someone who had to watch his mom break into pieces." Laura felt the floor tilt. "And what do you think will happen now? Do you think he's going to come back? Do you think he's going to apologize because you humiliated him?" Daniel didn't answer. "Do you know what you just did? Those files could get him into serious legal trouble. They could start an investigation. You could have ruined his life. And ours? Didn't he ruin ours?" The exchange of glances was brutal. Neither blinked. They both knew something had broken between them. Laura stood up. She walked to the door, then stopped. "Don't do anything again without talking to me." "Nothing, do you hear me?" "I did it for you," he murmured. "Then you should have asked me first. Because helping is not acting out of anger. That's called revenge. And it doesn't make you any better than him." She closed the door. She couldn't hold it in anymore. In the hallway, she collapsed to the floor and broke down in tears, covering her mouth with her hands to keep from screaming. Marcos called 3 times that night. She didn't answer. She didn't know how to face that conversation. She didn't know if it was already too late. At 10:41, the landline rang. No one used it. Laura jumped. She picked up. "Hello? Mrs. Laura?" "Yes, who's speaking?" "Sorry for the time. We're calling from the Fiscal Control Department. We've received a digital package in your name with sensitive documents related to our group, a company in which Mr. Marcos Ruiz appears as a hidden shareholder." Laura froze. "No, that wasn't. Could you come to our office tomorrow to give a formal statement? Just as a protocol." Yes, of course." She hung up. She approached Daniel's room. She didn't enter. She just leaned her head against the door and whispered, "What are you becoming, my son?" Daniel was awake. He had heard everything. And for the first time in weeks, he felt fear. Not for himself, but for what he had unleashed into the world without understanding the consequences. Somewhere in the city, Marcos was leaving the gym. His phone buzzed. A message from Julian Malverde. "We need to talk. Urgent. Something very serious just came in. Are you involved in this?" Marcos felt a cold sweat. The next day, Laura went to the ministry. She gave her statement. She remained firm. She said she knew nothing. That she never touched the computer. That she just found it on. She signed papers. She left with the feeling of falling into a void. Carmen was waiting for her at home. She had made soup. "Tell me it was him," said Laura as she entered. "Who?" "Daniel. It was him who got involved in all this." I don't know how to stop him." Carmen stayed silent for a few seconds. "You can't stop him, Laura. You can only teach him not to destroy himself along the way. What if he already has? Then you'll have to show him how to rebuild himself." That night, Daniel approached his mother with a notebook. "I want to tell you what I did. Everything." They sat down in the living room. Page by page, he explained how he accessed it, what he found, how he understood it, how he searched online for the addresses where he should send it. "I thought he'd realize that he can't do this to us and get away unscathed." Laura didn't know whether to cry, hug him, or yell at him. What if those people weren't just businessmen? What if they were something else? What if he's in danger now? Daniel looked down. "I didn't think about that." "Exactly. You didn't think about it. Because you're a child. And a child can't carry the punishment of an adult." They hugged. It was a hug full of guilt, love, and helplessness. That night, Marcos didn't sleep. His boss had suspended him. The documents were already circulating. The prosecutor was investigating. And someone had left a folded paper on his windshield. No signature, just a phrase. "You shouldn't have touched what wasn't yours." A child's revenge had become the beginning of a very dangerous game. And the entire family was now inside the board, even though no one had explained the rules. The first call came at 3:14 a.m. It didn't ring. It was just a dry vibration from the phone Laura had forgotten on the nightstand. She woke up suddenly, as if her body already knew what was coming. She looked at the screen without recognizing the number. It had an international prefix. She hesitated. She answered. "Hello?" The silence on the other side was dense, sticky. Then a deep male voice, with a barely perceptible accent, said something that left her frozen. "Tell Marcos it's no longer about money. Now it's personal." Laura was frozen. She wanted to ask who it was, but the call was cut off before her mouth could form a word. Her heart started racing, and her body trembled under the sheets as if the cold had taken human form. She ran to Daniel's room. He was sleeping soundly, tangled in his blue blanket, unaware of the abyss that was opening wider under his feet. She covered him more securely. She stroked his hair. Then she went downstairs to the kitchen, turned on the light, and stood there, phone in hand, staring into space as if the house was no longer hers, as if the air was filled with something dirty. She couldn't ignore it. Something very dark had started. Marcos showed up that morning without warning. He knocked insistently. Laura looked through the peephole before opening the door. His face was disheveled. He had deep dark circles under his eyes, a scruffy beard, cracked lips. When she opened the door, he couldn't even speak right away. "I got fired. I have nowhere to stay. Carolina blocked me. My accounts are frozen. And someone is following me." Laura didn't invite him in. She left him standing at the door, trembling. She looked at him as if she was seeing him for the first time. "What did you do, Marcos?" I don't know. I swear I don't know. The documents. I never thought that would leave the company. I didn't know Daniel." "Don't say his name," she interrupted sharply. "Don't bring our son into this. You planted all of this. You played with fire." "Laura, they're threatening me. They called me. They're watching me. There's a guy who shows up where I'm staying. He doesn't say anything, just smokes and watches me. They left a note on the door of my building. They said they know who you are. And where Daniel lives." Her blood stopped for a second. She felt a tug in her stomach, a kind of vertigo. What does the note say? Marcos pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to her. Laura read it quietly. Your son was smarter than you. Next time, we'll talk to him. She had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. She looked at him with a contorted face. You leave right now. I don't want you anywhere near here. Don't set foot in this house. Don't cross that gate again. I don't care if you die in the street. You earned it, Marcos. You provoked it. We don't have to pay for your mistakes. Marcos didn't argue. He just lowered his head, and for a moment, she thought she saw something like pure fear in his eyes. He left without saying another word. And Laura locked the door with the double lock, something she had never done. That night, the phone rang again. Blocked number. She answered with a tense voice. What do you want? A dry laugh. Then another sentence. You don't know what your son found, do you? I have nothing to do with that. He's just a kid. A kid who messed with accounts worth millions. A kid who exposed people who can't be mentioned. This doesn't go away, ma'am. Not with apologies. Not with tears. What do you want from me? We want silence. Total. And for the child to learn not to play spy. They disconnected. Laura stood still. It wasn't just the ruin of her marriage. It was something bigger. Something more twisted. She sat at the table, her hands covering her mouth. She could hardly breathe. She wrote to Carmen, just one sentence. Come. It's urgent. Then she looked out the window. A dark car was parked in front of her house. The lights were out. No one moved inside. Carmen arrived in a bathrobe with a flashlight and a paper bag. She came in without asking questions. Laura shut the door behind her and showed her the note. Carmen read it. She didn't say a word. She poured herself some tea. Then they sat across from each other. You can't stay here. And where am I supposed to go? Anywhere. A hotel. A friend's house. I'd go with you, but if we leave together, they'll notice. You need to move quietly. Daniel has school. And if tomorrow he doesn't come back because someone takes him in a van without plates, will you console yourself with his homework? Laura stood up abruptly. Don't say that. Then act. You don't have time. Laura packed a bag with the essentials. Clothes for 3 days. Medicine. Copies of documents. Cash. She woke Daniel at 5. She didn't explain everything. She just looked at him and said, We're leaving. Daniel looked at her, sleepy. Where to? To a place where no one can hurt us. During the trip, Laura gradually told him everything. The calls. The threats. The car. The message. Daniel stayed silent. His eyes wide open, no tears fell. But his jaw trembled. I didn't want this to happen, he said. I just wanted him to feel what he did to us. You made him feel it, Daniel. You broke him. But you also opened a door we can't close now. We'll survive, you hear me? But that depends on you not acting without thinking again. They arrived at a hostel on the outskirts. No one knew them there. They asked for a room without registering with real names. Laura used her second surname. Daniel took a shower, lay down, and fell asleep without saying another word. Laura couldn't. She sat by the window all night, listening to every sound as if it were a gunshot. The next day, she received a photo on her phone. It was the facade of Daniel's school, followed by a message, nice facilities. Do you think he'll like going back? Laura put the phone away, locked herself in the bathroom, and vomited. Then she washed her face, looked at her reflection, and whispered, You won't touch us. Meanwhile, Marcos was cornered. He could no longer enter his building without feeling the footsteps behind him. He received messages without senders with phrases like, Do you like the view from your window? Or, We told you not to touch those funds. He tried to find Carolina. He found her in a cafe. She saw him from a distance and stood up before he reached the table. She said only one sentence. I don't want to die for someone who can't keep secrets. And she left. Marcos went to the police. He wanted to file a report. But he had no concrete proof. Just calls from blocked numbers, messages that disappeared. No camera had captured anything. They mocked him. They told him it was probably paranoia. He left the station with the feeling that he was alone. Completely alone. Laura returned to the city 3 days later. Not because the threats had stopped, but because staying hidden didn't guarantee safety either. She needed to move, be unpredictable. She enrolled Daniel in online classes, stopped using her card, sold the car, and bought an old one with cash. She spoke to Carmen only once, using a neighbor's phone. She asked her to burn the papers left in the house, to tell everyone they had gone to another city. Every night before bed, Daniel asked, "Are they going to find us?" Laura looked at him and replied, "No, if we keep being smarter." But inside, she knew that wasn't enough. The men making those calls weren't after money or revenge. They were after silence. And when silence didn't come, they made others bring it by force. That same night, the car appeared again. But this time, someone got out. They knocked on the hostel door. Laura didn't breathe. From the other side, a soft, polite voice said, "Mrs. Ruiz, we just want to talk." Laura slowly approached, with Daniel behind her. She didn't open the door. She only asked, "Who are you?" "The ones who come to offer an exit. One time. Only one time." "What exit?" "Give us back what's missing, and no one else will be involved." Laura understood. Daniel hadn't sent everything. There was more, and they knew it. "Leave. I have nothing left. That will be a problem. For you. For the child. For those who still protect you." They left. Daniel looked at her, pale. "There's more," he confessed. Laura closed her eyes. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. It wasn't just a story of abandonment anymore. Now they were inside something much bigger. And they still didn't know the real name of the enemy. They only knew it was breathing close. And it wasn't planning on stopping. The next morning, Laura didn't need to look in the rearview mirror to know they were being followed. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a cold certainty that dug into her skin like a needle of ice. The gray car had been behind them since they left the hostel that morning, keeping an uncomfortably precise distance. Never too close. Never close enough to be obvious. But always there. Unyielding. As if it wasn't in a hurry. As if it knew fear worked best when it was cooked slowly. They changed routes 3 times. They made unnecessary loops. At one point, they stopped in front of a convenience store, pretending to look for something in the purse, just to glance out of the corner of her eye to see if the car passed. It didn't. It stopped too, and turned off the lights. Daniel sat silently, watching his mother from the passenger seat. His face was tense, but what disturbed him the most wasn't the fear, but the expression of contained defeat. As if Laura knew the trap was closing, and there were no more elegant exits. Only ugly decisions. He didn't say anything. It was no longer time for words. He had discovered something that slithered beneath words. They returned to Carmen's old apartment, entering through the back door. Laura had left Daniel under the care of a neighbor while she went to buy supplies. Only 20 minutes had passed, but when she returned, she found him pale, curled up on the couch, his eyes wide open. The woman, a heavy-set lady with a shrill voice, didn't seem to understand the gravity of what had happened. He said he came from the town hall, the neighbor explained. That he needed to do a safety survey. That it would only take a moment. I offered him to come in, but he said it was better to talk to the boy directly. Then he left. Laura felt the blood rush to her head. "What did he ask you, Daniel?" "He asked if we lived here. If I had any brothers or sisters. If my dad came to visit me. He asked me to write my name on a paper, but I didn't do it. He told me not to tell you." "What did he look like?" "Very short hair. A white shirt. He had a scar on his cheek. And his eyes, he didn't blink. Mom, he didn't look at me like a normal adult. He looked at me like I was merchandise." Laura had to sit down. Carmen appeared from behind with a tray of tea that she set on the table without saying a word. Then she sat next to Laura and held her hand tightly. "There's something I need to tell you. And I don't know why I didn't say it earlier." Laura looked at her with eyes full of a mixture of anger and pleading. "When you and Marcos met, he was already involved in strange things. I didn't say anything because it was just a rumor, and you seemed so happy, so sure that you had found your perfect man. But in the building where he worked, people talked. There was a guy who handled the files, an accountant, who said Marcos received envelopes with no return address. That he traveled to countries where his company didn't even have offices. That once he was seen coming out of a private clinic in Mexico City with a suitcase full of money. Nothing was ever proven. But there was something. There's always been. Laura clenched her lips until they hurt. What do you think he was doing? I think he was laundering money. And not for drugs. For human trafficking. Organs. Babies. I heard it, Laura. Not once. Several times. No one dares to talk about it, but those networks exist. And if someone stole sensitive information and published it, then the hunt isn't for Marcos. It's for whoever might open their mouth. Laura covered her mouth with both hands. She felt nauseous. She felt like the world was spinning toward a place she never wanted to imagine. I have to find someone. Someone who can explain to me what Marcos did. Someone who knows from the inside. Who? Fernando Rios. He's a lawyer. He worked with Marcos for years. They weren't friends, but they tolerated each other. He left the firm 2 years ago. He said he couldn't stand the moral trash of their clients anymore. Carmen stared at her. Can you trust him? No, but I can pay him. And sometimes that's enough. Laura left Daniel with Carmen and drove for over an hour until she reached a dilapidated office in the center of town. The sign was half falling down. The reception smelled of mildew. She knocked on the office door. Fernando opened with a look of annoyance, but when he saw her, he changed. Not out of affection. Out of fear. Laura, I didn't expect to see you. Are you okay? No. And I don't have time for small talk. I need to know what Marcos was involved in. Fernando closed the door and asked her to sit. He opened a bottle of water, poured a glass, and handed it to her with trembling hands. You shouldn't have come. I've already come. Talk. Marcos was the front for a very specific group. They paid him to sign papers, open companies abroad, make moves that laundered money from illegal clinics. Clinics that operated on the border. Organ trafficking. Especially kidneys. Marcos never held a scalpel, but he signed transfers. And took his cut. And you knew about it? I suspected. But when I started asking questions, they sent me a pig's head in a box. The next day I quit. Laura swallowed hard. What happens now? If someone leaked documents, that's not just financial betrayal. It's an attack on a criminal structure that has operated for years without anyone touching it. They're not looking for punishment. They're looking for silence. Absolute. And if they have to kill 10 people to get it, they'll do it without blinking. Is there any way to stop them? Yes, but not from here. Not alone. This is a federal matter. International. And if you're going to report it, you're going to need evidence, custody, lawyers, and luck. My son has more files. And they're following me. They already came for him. Fernando stood up. He paced back and forth, then stopped in front of her. Look, I'm going to give you an address. There's a prosecutor who works on transnational corruption crimes. Her name is Mariana Valdez. She's incorruptible. But if you give her what she needs, you'll stay under the radar. You'll become a political target. And then, yes, they'll be able to protect you. Laura wrote everything down. She thanked him. And left with one thought in her head, get to that woman before anyone made them disappear. When she returned to Carmen's house, she noticed a folded piece of paper under the door. It wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to Daniel. She opened it. It was a note written in elegant cursive. Dear Daniel, sometimes secrets are like poisons. It's better to leave them where they were. Strong men know when to stop. Don't keep looking. Don't play hero. We're not villains. Just people with different rules. Be careful what you dream. Sometimes dreams find you. Laura felt the ground open beneath her feet. She ran upstairs to hug her son. She didn't say anything. She just held him as if her body could be a shield. But in her mind, there were no more doubts. They were in the crosshairs, and time was running out. The next morning, the crackling of dry leaves under Daniel's boots was the last thing Laura heard before turning around desperately. She was on the sidewalk at the school's exit, with her backpack hanging from one shoulder, but her eyes were not where they should have been. They were fixed on a man who had just turned the corner, walking too slowly, as if he were waiting for something. Daniel didn't say anything. He simply got into the car with the petrified expression of someone who has just recognized a face that shouldn't be in this plane of reality. Laura needed no more than a second. She slammed the door shut, started the engine, and took a route she hadn't used in months. She didn't turn on the music, didn't speak, didn't look at her son. She drove with her fingers tight on the wheel, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she were waiting for the landscape to dissolve with her will. Daniel didn't break the silence either. Fear was no longer felt as an emotion, but as a substance filling the air between them. Every turn, every vehicle behind them, every traffic light was a potential trap. They didn't return to the apartment. They didn't stop at Carmen's house. They didn't stop anywhere familiar. Laura drove until the map in her mind lost its lines, where the road signs were old and the streetlights sparse. Finally, an unnamed road led them to a dirt path climbing through wet land surrounded by pine trees. There, at the end of a barely marked trail, appeared the cabin. It had no luxuries. It had no neighbors. There was no cell signal. But it had locks on all the windows, a well with clean water, and enough distance for the city wolves to forget their scent. Upon arrival, Laura got out of the car without saying a word. She checked the entrance. Entered, lit the fireplace. Then she came out and looked at Daniel. He was still sitting in the seat, holding his backpack. When she looked at him, she didn't know if what she saw was sadness or guilt. Maybe both. She extended her hand. Daniel got out. They entered together. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and contained dampness. Dust danced in the rays of light passing through the curtains. It was a place suspended in time. Far from the world. Exactly what they needed. The first minutes passed in silence. Laura made something simple, rice with tuna and tea. They ate sitting on the floor on a rug in front of the fireplace. When Daniel finished his plate, he lifted his eyes. Will they find us? Laura looked at him for a long time before responding. No, if we don't make noise. No one can hear us here. And no one knows we're here. How long will we stay? Until I come up with a plan. Or until I stop shaking every time I hear an approaching engine. Daniel lay down, leaning against his backpack. He was exhausted. His body betrayed the stress of the last few weeks. Laura covered him with a blanket and left him to sleep. Then she sat alone in front of the fireplace. There, in the crackling of the fire, she began to remember. She remembered her mother. How she pretended nothing was happening when her father came home drunk. How she closed the curtains when the shouting became unbearable. She remembered her younger sister, who once wet her bed out of fear, and how no one said a word. Because in that house, things were not talked about. They were swallowed. And repeated. Like a cycle designed to crush the fragile. She remembered how she had sworn her son would never experience anything like that. And there he was. Hidden. Hunted. With a story that seemed written by someone who hated hope. The tears came on their own. They weren't soft. They were hard, silent, salty like blades. She wasn't crying only for what was happening to them. She cried for everything she had allowed. For all the times she had closed her eyes. For the signs she ignored. For loving Marcos. For not seeing that the wolf had already been inside from the beginning. Meanwhile, Marcos was trapped in his own tragedy. He tried to follow Laura, but his efforts were futile. No one answered him. He had no access to his accounts. His phone was tracked. And his reputation was dragged through the dirt. In a desperate act, he went to find an old colleague. Someone with connections. Someone who owed him favors. He found him in an underground parking lot. But he wasn't alone. There were 3 men surrounding him. One said his name in a voice that sounded bored. The second asked if he thought he could play with other people's money without paying the price. The third didn't speak. He just broke his nose with a swift blow. They beat him without anger. With precision. With method. As if his body were a file that needed adjustments. They broke 2 of his ribs. Dislocated his shoulder. They left him on the ground, vomiting blood and screaming like a cornered animal. They whispered something before leaving. Sometimes death is a gift, but you still have to watch everything fall apart. Then we'll talk about endings. He was found hours later, among garbage bags, with a face that was unrecognizable. They took him to the hospital. He went into a coma before they could perform a CT scan. Laura found out from the news. No one called her. She just saw an image on the TV screen in the cabin's living room. Businessman involved in international money laundering found unconscious in critical condition. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She simply turned off the TV. Daniel, who had also seen it, came over and asked, "Is he dead?" "No, not yet. Do you want him to die?" Laura stayed silent for a moment. "I don't want him to suffer anymore, or to keep dragging anyone with him. Do you still love him?" Laura lowered her gaze. She was honest. "I don't know, my love. Sometimes yes. Sometimes I hate him. Sometimes I feel sorry for him. Sometimes I just want him to disappear from my story. Is that possible? You can try." That night, Laura sat with Daniel and asked him to talk. Not about files. Not about emails. About him. About what he felt. About what he feared. About what he thought. It was a conversation that lasted for hours. Daniel talked about his nightmares. About how he heard voices. About how sometimes he thought it was all his fault. About how he wished he had never touched the computer. About how he hated his father and himself for hating him. Laura listened without interrupting. Then she said, "This didn't start with you. It started long before. You were the first to dare to plant a bomb in that silence. You're not the one to blame, my son. You're the witness. And the survivor. And you? I'm the one trying to understand how cages are built. So I don't get into another one." They slept holding each other that night, as if the cold of the outside world could wait a little longer, as if fear for a few hours could fall asleep too. The days passed slowly. Laura began to write. Letters. Memories. Loose ideas. She felt she needed to leave something in case they didn't come back. Daniel painted. He used charcoal and recycled paper. He made dark, intense drawings. Figures with blurred faces. Giant eyes, doors, keys. The connection between them in the midst of exile grew. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it was real. They told each other the truth. They spoke with respect. They looked at each other without fear. Until one day, after coming back from searching for firewood, they found a stone on the dining table. There were no notes, no blood, just the stone. Perfectly round, white, smooth. Laura knew what it meant. They knew. They had found them. And the clock had started ticking again, this time towards the end. The silence in the cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. And Laura knew it. The white stone remained at the center of the table like a silent witness, a mark left with purpose, without physical violence, but with full intent to destabilize. Daniel had touched it barely upon entering. It was warm, as if it had been placed just minutes before. There were no fingerprints, no marks, no symbols. Just that white, polished, perfect stone, one that seemed to have been taken from the bed of an ancient river and turned into a message. They knew. They were close. There was no safe place anymore. Laura blocked doors and windows. She didn't say a word. She went to the cupboard, took out the old rusty gun her father had left her before he died, and checked if it was still loaded. 2 bullets. Only 2. She remembered she had never fired a single bullet in her life. Daniel watched her from the kitchen doorway, his eyes empty with fear, as if nothing could affect him anymore. "Are they going to kill us?" Laura lowered the gun and approached him. She placed a hand on his face. "Not as long as I'm breathing. Then don't close your eyes tonight." That night, it didn't rain. The wind didn't blow. The branches didn't creak. There was only that silence that forewarns things no one wants to name. Laura left a candle burning in the living room and another by the back door. She and Daniel took turns sleeping for short periods. He insisted on keeping watch. He was 11, but spoke as if childhood had evaporated in a matter of weeks. At 3:47, the candle by the door went out for no apparent reason. Laura immediately stood up. She grabbed the gun. She walked silently. The floorboards creaked under her weight, as if they wanted to warn the person already outside. She slowly opened the door. And there he was. A man, standing 2 meters away. Tall, stocky, with a long coat that wasn't appropriate for the season. His face was covered with a scarf up to his nose. Dark eyes. Impossible to read. He had no visible weapon. He wasn't in a hurry. "Laura Ruiz," he said, with a voice that sounded too soft for the threat it carried. "How difficult it's been to find you." She raised the weapon, aimed without hesitation. "You leave now, or you won't walk out of here." The man smiled. A toothless smile, more tense than ironic. "You know I didn't come to kill you. If I did, you'd already be dead. I came to give you the option no one else will give you. I don't want to hear anything from you. You've heard enough. And you didn't understand anything. It's not about Marcos. He was just a tool. A link. Your son accessed information that shouldn't have existed. You opened your mouth when you should have stayed quiet. You're where you shouldn't be. I'm not alone anymore. Of course not. You have a kid who thinks he can save the world with files. An old neighbor spying through the windows. And a gun in need of maintenance." Laura tightened the grip on the gun. Her finger was already brushing the trigger. "One more step and you'll know for yourself." "Just listen to this," said the man, with a different firmness. "Return the original file. The complete one. We know you have it. We want it by Monday. If you deliver it, everything ends. If not, the next thing you'll receive won't be a stone. It will be a photograph." "Of what?" "Of someone you love. Dead." The man turned. He began to walk. He didn't run. He didn't hurry. He left as if he knew no one would dare follow him. Laura watched him disappear between the trees. She closed the door, leaned against it, and began to tremble. Daniel appeared behind her. He didn't say anything, just extended his hand. "Give it to me." Laura looked at him. "The gun?" "Yes." "No." "Mom." "Give it to me." "No. And don't ask me again." Daniel looked at her with a new fire in his eyes. "If they come back, I want to be ready." "No, son. If they come back, I'm the one shooting." For the first time, he broke. He sat on the floor, cried silently, cried with his teeth clenched, like someone who no longer wants to be a child. Laura knelt down beside him, hugged him tightly. "They won't touch us. I'll fix this." "How?" Laura looked at him. "I'll go after them." "What?" "I'm not going to sit here waiting for them to decide when to ruin us. I'll go after them. I'll give everything up. To the one person who can actually do something." "Mariana Valdez?" "Yes." "What if she's bought too? Then it will be the last mistake we make. But I'd rather that than watch them tear us apart from the inside every night." At dawn, they packed. Laura left the stone on the threshold of the door. In response, as a challenge, they returned to the city. Not by the main route. Not by the paved road. They took secondary paths, dusty streets, trails where the signs no longer existed. When they reached the city, they went straight to Mariana Valdez's office. Mariana didn't greet them immediately. Her secretary asked for an appointment, but Laura didn't leave. She stayed in the waiting room. She waited 5 hours. When Mariana came out of her office, Laura stood in front of her with unwavering firmness. "My name is Laura Ruiz. What I'm about to give you may cost my son and me our lives. But if you don't do something, it will cost the lives of many more people." Mariana looked at her silently. Then she nodded her head. "Follow me." She led them into a secure room, closed the door, activated a signal jammer. She looked at Laura with a mix of curiosity and distrust. "Speak." Laura pulled out a USB drive. She placed it on the table. "This is what my son found. What he sent. What was saved. There are organ trafficking routes, offshore accounts, names of politicians, doctors, customs officers. All linked to a structure that has been operating for over 10 years. How did you get this?" "My ex-husband worked for them. He didn't even know the whole story. He was just a cog in the machine. His computer had everything. My son downloaded it." Mariana plugged in the USB. She started going through it. Her face hardened. This is a bomb. Yes. Do you have any idea how many people are involved here? Yes. Do you know what you're asking me? To do what no one else has wanted to do. This makes me a target. And you a key witness. This can't be handled with a court order and a few patrol cars. Then handle it however you need to. But don't look at me like I have a choice. Because I don't. Mariana took a deep breath. You'll need protection. Real protection. We'll have to move them. Security. Temporary identities. And lots of silence. Do it. But promise me one thing. What? Don't let them bury it again. Don't let this get lost in the bureaucracy. Don't let the monsters keep breathing easy. Mariana nodded. I'm not the type to get scared easily. Meanwhile, Carmen had followed her own path. From her house, she started contacting old acquaintances. People from the union. Fallen journalists. One of them, a reporter who now lived in a boarding house, told her something that left her in shock. Your son-in-law worked for a man named Arturo Ferreira. That name doesn't appear on any official list. But his people are everywhere. He never appears. He's a shadow. No one has seen him. No one can prove he exists. But everything he touches becomes untouchable. Carmen asked for a favor. To get a copy of a list. Names that matched the trafficking routes. The journalist called her 2 days later. He said he had the list. But there was a surprise. Your name is on it. What? Not you. But a Carmen Ruiz appears as a trusted contact in a 2009 payment. From a clinic in Quito. Carmen hung up. She didn't understand anything. But she knew she had to tell Laura. When they met, Laura listened carefully. Then they reviewed the papers together. The Carmen Ruiz on the list had been a nurse in an international brigade. Carmen remembered that in 2009 she traveled to Ecuador with an NGO. They helped with births. They received donations. One of the clinics seemed clean, efficient. She never thought it was a facade. Maybe they used my name without permission. Or maybe we were all pieces. Laura hugged her. You're not alone. I'm not either. And if they ever wanted us to stay silent, now is when we must speak the most. And on the other side of the city, a dark, empty office with soundproof walls received a call from a country without a flag. A male voice asked, "Do you have the child?" The response was brief. Not yet. But now we know where they'll be. And this time, they won't have anywhere to run. On the other side of the city, the hallway was long, with gray walls that absorbed the sound, as if the building itself knew that no light words were spoken there. Laura walked with firm steps, but inside, she was trembling. She carried a sealed envelope under her arm, sealed with red tape, marked with her case number, not her name. No one was supposed to know who she was in that building, and even though her face had been hidden in all the documents, she felt like every glance pierced her. The protection agent had told her not to look back, that if anyone recognized her, she should remain silent and keep walking. With each step, she remembered the man's voice in the cabin, his words like knives. If you hand over the file, it's over. But what he didn't say was who defines that over. The door to office 402 opened before she could knock. Mariana Valdez greeted her without makeup, without pleasantries. She held a folder in one hand and a steaming coffee in the other. She motioned for Laura to come in. The room was lined with old wood. A clean desk, an open laptop with multiple windows. 2 chairs facing each other. No plants. No smiles. Are you ready? Laura nodded. Mariana sat across from her and opened the folder. This is no longer just a complaint. It's a war of structures. In the past few weeks, names that had been dormant for years have been activated. Ghost companies have vanished. Banks have frozen accounts. There are movements in 3 embassies. And someone ordered the closure of a case in Ecuador that had been archived for years. Do you know what that means? That this was bigger than we thought. Much bigger. And you went all the way. Laura took a deep breath. Mariana didn't offer any comfort. It wasn't her style. It wasn't her job. Marcos has been located, Mariana said bluntly. He woke up from the coma. He's weak, but lucid. The prosecutor wants to interrogate him. And they've asked for you to be present. Officially, no. But the truth is, you're the only one who can face him without breaking. The problem is, he doesn't want to talk to anyone. Only you. Laura closed her eyes. What does he want? Redemption. Or manipulation? At this point, no one knows what the difference is. She agreed. Not because she trusted him. Not because she wanted to see him. She did it because she knew that closing a circle didn't always come with forgiveness. Sometimes it was closed with a firm look that tells the executioner that they can no longer hurt you. They found him in a hospital room with dim lighting, his skin hanging like a wet rag, dark purple circles under his eyes, the face of a man who had seen his true reflection and couldn't bear it. When Laura entered, he turned his head. It took him a few seconds to speak. You're still beautiful. Don't start with that. It's not a compliment. It's guilt. I'm not interested in your guilt. Just your truth. Marco swallowed. His eyes watered. I never understood the extent of what I was doing. I signed papers. Authorized transfers. It was money. Just money. Until I saw the names. I saw the children. The women. The bodies. They were no longer numbers. They were people mutilated to enrich ghosts. And you were one of them. Yes, because it was easier to stay silent. Because they offered me more than I was worth. Why do you only want to talk to me? Because you're the only one who saw me as a human when I was already rotting inside. And still, you loved me. Laura lowered her gaze. I loved you when I believed you could still be saved. And now? Now I just hope you pay. Marco sighed, closed his eyes. Take care of him. Take care of Daniel. He's the only thing I did right. And if something bad happens to him because of me, I swear I'd rather die. Laura didn't answer. She stood up, walked to the door. But before leaving, she turned. You weren't just a coward. You were an accomplice. And if you dare to call that an error, you deserve much more than this hospital. She left without looking back. Meanwhile, Daniel was attending his third therapy session. The therapist, a young man with a kind gaze and no surname on the plaque, welcomed him patiently. Daniel still didn't speak fluently, but he no longer avoided the therapist's gaze. He drew, talked about small things. And this time, he said a phrase that froze the atmosphere. My dad let evil use him. I almost did the same. The therapist looked at him. Why do you think that? Because I wanted to destroy him. And if they had given me the power, I would have done it. Without hesitation. Like they do. And now? Daniel clenched the pencil between his fingers. Now I don't want to be like him. But I'm afraid I already am. The therapist wrote something down. Then he said, we are not what we feel. We are what we decide to do with it. That day, Daniel talked about the cabin, the stone, the man at the door. He talked about Laura. And for the first time, he allowed himself to say, I'm scared, without breaking. And that's why he didn't break. Laura, for her part, received a call right after leaving Mariana's office. It was from the hospital. Carmen had been admitted urgently. She had fallen on the stairs of her building. Hip fracture. Minor trauma. Nothing irreversible. But the emotional impact was brutal. Laura ran to the hospital. She entered the room. Found Carmen semi-conscious, with a bruised face. She took her hand. You're my pillar, you crazy old lady. You can't fall right now. Carmen smiled weakly. I fell because you weren't here to yell at me to watch the ground. Don't do this to me again. You neither. Don't disappear again. Don't leave me alone with my ghosts. Laura stayed to sleep in a chair. During the night, she thought about her childhood. How Carmen had been the only adult who didn't lie to her. How she cared for Daniel as if he were her grandson. How life gave you new families when the blood ones failed. She thought about the file. The list of names. The victims. The calls. Everything that hadn't been said yet. Mariana contacted her that week. We have orders. There will be arrests. But I warn you right away, there will be consequences. They'll offer you deals. They'll offer you silence in exchange for peace. What are you going to do? Laura didn't hesitate. I want this to burn. I want everyone who signed, kept quiet, turned away, to see their reflection in public shame. I didn't hide to stay silent now. Mariana smiled for the first time. Then prepare yourself, because this will hurt. And it hurt. But for the first time, it hurt with purpose. The judgment of life had begun. And this time, Laura wasn't the victim. She was the key witness. She was the mother who chose not to repeat mistakes. She was the woman who faced the system and looked it in the eye. She was the voice others tried to silence. But it was too late. No one could silence her now. And the echo of her decisions was about to explode. Days later, the news came without warning, wrapped in a suspicious silence and a lack of details that said much more than any headline. Marcos Ruiz disappeared during his transfer to a private hearing. There were no cameras recording the route, no agents witnessing the exact moment. Just an empty car, open doors, and a technical report mentioning a protocol security failure. Mariana knew before anyone else. And when she called Laura, her voice was neither cold nor professional. It was the voice of someone who had already seen too much. They took him. Laura didn't need to ask who. She knew as soon as she hung up. She knew that the silent warning hanging over her days had been fulfilled. There was no body, no call. Just a certainty stuck to her skin. Someone decided that Marcos had already said enough. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor as if in the knots of the woods she could find a map to the future. Daniel watched her from the door. He didn't ask her what was happening. They no longer needed words to communicate. He approached, touched her shoulder, and sat next to her. She took his hand. They didn't do anything else. They just stayed there, in silence, supporting each other, breathing the same air that once was fear but was now beginning to be something else. 2 weeks later, Mariana informed her that the investigation would continue, though some witnesses had disappeared or retracted. The trial would continue for the lesser suspects. The big names were no longer within reach. They moved like shadows, impossible to capture without another sacrifice. Laura made a decision. She closed the circle in her heart. Not out of resignation, but out of necessity. She couldn't keep living as a survivor. She needed to build something. Something tangible. Something that could sustain others. She got up early one morning, walked to an old abandoned building on the corner of her street, and asked to speak to the owner. An old man who remembered being friends with her father. She offered to fix it, paint it, give it life. She had no money, but she had hands. She had friends. She had a story she no longer wanted to hide. The neighborhood responded, not with speeches, but with actions. One neighbor offered paint. Another, a work table. Carmen, still recovering from her fall, organized a sale of empanadas to cover part of the furniture. Daniel drew a poster by hand, with firm strokes and simple typography. Popular Health Office, Dr. Laura Ruiz. When she opened for the first time, there were no new stretchers or digital stethoscopes. There was a chair, a table, a borrowed lamp, and an open heart. The first patient was a child with a cough. Then a woman with a headache. Then an elderly man with high blood pressure. They came without an appointment, without papers, without money. And Laura treated them the same. Because now her medicine was no longer just technique. It was humanity. It was redemption. Daniel began writing. He did it every afternoon while his mother worked. He wrote in silence, his fingers firm on the keyboard of an old laptop that Mariana had given him. He wrote about fear, about what he felt when reading those files, about power, resentment, and forgiveness, about how he almost lost himself trying to punish someone else. His essay, titled "The Decisions That Don't Choose for Us," was published on a school blog. Then it went viral. A teacher presented it at a youth conference. And soon, Daniel was invited to give lectures in other schools. Not as a hero, as a witness. As someone who looked into the abyss and decided to come back. One afternoon, while Laura was making coffee in the office, a child entered with a flower in his hand. He didn't come for medicine. He came to thank her for curing his mother. He left the flower on the table and ran out. Laura looked at the flower, a slightly crooked sunflower, and felt that something inside her was finally blooming as well. Carmen became the soul of the office. She greeted patients, made tea for them, and organized the appointments with an old notebook she treated like an oracle. Every time she saw Laura, she said the same thing. "You're doing what many won't dare to do, starting over without hate." One evening, while they were walking through the park, Daniel asked, "Have you forgiven him?" Laura took a while to respond. "No, but I learned not to let his shadow walk behind me. What if he comes back?" "He can't come back. And if he does, I won't be the same woman who loved that man." They stopped in front of a small lake. The water was calm. Daniel looked at her. "I forgave him." "Why?" "Because I got tired of carrying it. And because I want whatever comes into my life to not have his voice behind it." Laura hugged him. It was a long hug with no rush. The kind of hug you give when you understand that love, when it's pure, can also heal what others have dirted. Months later, Mariana visited her in the office. She didn't come as a prosecutor. She came as a woman, as someone who had also paid the price of fighting against the system. She handed her an envelope. It was a closed file. It couldn't be published. But inside was the final report of the case. Some names. Some evidence. None of that would come to light. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. "This is as far as we got without being killed," said Mariana. "I leave this with you, so you know it was worth it." Laura didn't open it at that moment. She put it in a box, among documents, away from Daniel's sight. Not because she wanted to hide it, but because she understood the past had already done enough damage. That night, Daniel read her part of his new essay. Sometimes, growing up is not about learning new things. It's about unlearning the pain, stopping feeding resentment, and deciding that our story is not a cage, but a wound that heals if we stop scratching it. Sometimes, forgiveness is not a white flag. It's a door we open to ourselves. Laura listened with shining eyes. She stroked his cheek and smiled. They walked through the park, hand in hand. The sun was setting slowly, painting everything with golden hues. They didn't speak. It wasn't needed. Every step was a declaration. Every silence a promise. They had been through hell, and not only had they come out, but they had also planted flowers along the way. Sometimes life doesn't ask for explanations. It asks for decisions. And Laura made hers, to live without fear, to love without guilt, and to move forward, even when the ghosts tried to remind her of what she once was. Because deep down, the real ending is not the punishment for the guilty. It's the freedom for those who survived. And the choice to build a new story where the pain is not the protagonist, but just a line in the first chapter of something bright. And finally, walking with her son under the golden light of a clear afternoon, Laura understood that this too was justice. A justice that doesn't make the newspapers, but heals from deep within. The justice of having endured, of having chosen, of staying alive, and free. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep posting emotional stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We greatly appreciate having you here with us, and you can click on the links that are showing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. A hug.